Hello and welcome to a discussion on an important question of our time. Mission accomplished? Reimagining victory in an age of endless wars. I'm Lyse Doucet. As wars of our time drag on, these endless wars come to be felt by those who live through them as forever wars. Now, wars do end at some point, or at least shift into new kinds of conflict. Is it still possible in our time to speak of winners and losers in war as we did in wars of the last century? What does it mean in our time to win a war today? Is it about taking territory, suppressing all opposition, a new order? How do we reimagine victory in this age of endless wars? We meet to mark this year's 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, in this special series, Reimagining Victory, curated by the Imperial War Museum Institute, whose mission it is to deepen our understanding of war and conflict. And its partner in this series, Conciliation Resources, an international NGO for the past 25 years. It's been trying to end violent conflict and work for more peaceful societies. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And we have an excellent panel of two leading historians of war and peace and a policymaker turned peacemaker. Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Tony Blair from 1995 to 2007. And from 1997 to 2007, he was the Chief British Negotiator in Northern Ireland, playing a key role in bringing about the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. He then became the founder and CEO of Intermediate, a charity founded to work on conflict resolution around the world. We also have Tarak Barkawi. He's an historian of war and empire at the London School of Economics. And his last book, Soldiers of Empire, examined the multicultural armies of British Asia in the Second World War. And last but not least, Margaret MacMillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto and an Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University. She's the author of some widely read books, Paris 1919, Nixon and Mao, and the War That Ended Peace. Welcome to all of you. Let me ask all of you to set out your stall to see where you stand on this question. In our time, what constitutes a military victory? Margaret MacMillan, beginning with you.
We don't seem to have military victories much these days. We have wars that go on and on. I suppose the last clear-cut military victory was perhaps the Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein's government was overthrown, and that was the end of that particular phase of it, but the conflict didn't end, and it has continued. In fact, you could argue right up to the present day. Afghanistan has been going on now for almost 20 years. The Great Lakes War in Africa is still going on. So I think we're seeing these low-level conflicts, which are very difficult to end, of course, because they're also civil conflicts, which are then stirred up by outside powers. The wars of the past, fought between armies or fought between navies, tended to end when one side lost its hardware, lost its capacity to fight, and then they sat down and made peace. And we're not seeing that much these days because the nature of war itself is different.
Tarak Barkawi?
Well, I'm not sure that I would separate military and political in quite that way, but I would say three things about victory/defeat. One, that these are the terms that we use to make sense of wars, to narrativize them as having beginnings, middles, ends, and significant events. And I think those kinds of narratives change over time. So what a victory is and what it meant changes over the years as we go on. The second thing I'd say, following a little bit on what Margaret was saying, is there's an element of force to victory or defeat. If you're in Berlin 1945 and the Red Army is in occupation, you're going to have to reimagine what the Third Reich is. So there's an element of force. You're forced into it. But secondly, there's an element of interpretation. You choose to be defeated. You choose to fight a war. You decide that we're not defeated today, we're going to keep fighting even though it looks otherwise. And sort of drawing this together, I would say that victory and defeat are events that force us to reimagine ourselves. They force the combatant parties to reimagine who they are and their place in the world. Thank you.
Jonathan Powell?
Well, I think that we have to redefine victory a bit. It's no longer mission accomplished of the Second World War. You can still have victories, but they're a different sort of thing. You can take territory, of course, as in the Iraq War, but you don't solve the problem. Or even with ISIS more recently in Mesopotamia, in Syria and Iraq, ISIS was driven out of the territory. It's not been defeated. It's still fighting. So I think a victory is actually a lot more complicated. War can take a long time, and it's not new that war takes a long time. If you think of the war in Northern Ireland, that was 30 odd years. In Colombia, from the Violencia through to the peace process under President Santos, that was 60 odd years. In Burma, the civil war's been going on 60 years. What's happened is we've lost our patience. We used to have a great deal of patience about wars, and now we want an immediate solution. I think the key essence of a victory now is to get away from the idea of a zero-sum game. I was very struck looking back at the history of the Biafran War in Nigeria, where at the end of the war, where the Nigerian military had clearly won, they put posters everywhere saying no winners, no losers. But when I went to Spain and said this must be the outcome with ETA, there should be no winners, no losers, everyone was outraged and said the government must win, the terrorists must lose. But you don't get to victory that way. You actually need the people who are beaten to accept that this is the end, that this is going to be an agreement they can both accept. And that means you must not humiliate them. You need to have everyone be a winner, but in a way that actually leads you to a lasting peace. So it's a different sort of victory, I think, we're looking now in the modern times.
Yes, Margaret MacMillan. So what happened after the Second World War, this idea of surrender, we don't hear about surrender, as Jonathan just mentioned in his remarks.
No,
What changed after the Great War, that major war of the last century?
I think what Tarak and Jonathan have said is very interesting, because what we're doing is, and this happens with important words, they change their meanings over time. And so what was meant by victory in the 18th century was one government conceding what it wanted to another government and a formal arrangement being made. What victory meant in the 30 Years' War was something quite different, because that was a war of ideologies and a civil war and a war of social class against social class, among other things. And so victory meant very different things. People define victory, I think, given the nature, given their times. And so what would be a victory for crusaders is not a victory for perhaps an 18th century general. And I think defeat now means different things. I think defeat in big wars, big organized wars, with organized armed forces like the First and Second World War, tended to mean that one side conceded and said, we can no longer fight on, we want an armistice, we want to accept, we want to settle. And we understood victory and defeat in those terms, but I think we can't understand them in those terms today. And of course, the greater the object, ISIS has a global object, an ideological object. So victory for ISIS will be something very different from victory from, say, a traditional nation state that simply wants to take a bit of territory. So I think it's absolutely crucial that the meanings of the words keep changing. And I think today we're seeing that it is very, very difficult to get something that looks like victory, because those who are meant to concede don't and won't.
Let's just have one moment to ponder a little bit about the history of war. And I want to bring you in, Tarak, to the post-colonial wars that you spoke about. The idea of victory and defeat was much clearer then in those wars.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about war after 1945, one thing that I would say is there have been plenty of victories. They just haven't been ours in the West. You know, I got the invitation for this panel just as the Taliban is wrapping up its victory, its world historic victory, to take out a second superpower. So there clearly are victories happening. I think one thing that I would say is that part of what's happening in the discussion is that if you set out your goals as to make the world safe for democracy as a goal in your war, you're never going to win. If you set out a goal that's something less than that, you might have a chance that you achieve your objective. Part of what's happened with the West, especially lately, is the definition of goals, bringing democracy to Afghanistan or Iraq, that are simply unachievable. And so the military objectives that are achieved are, as it were, thrown away because the political objectives can't be achieved. But sort of endless and no victory strikes me as a West point of view right now, not the point of view of those who are fighting us.
But if you
We've
look
been
back
very, very
to
successful.
the Vietnam War, the French in Algeria, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan of earlier decades, those wars were, some would say, essentially unwinnable, Tarak Barkawi?
Again, unwinnable from whose perspective? All those wars were won. I mean,
But
it's
unwinnable, I meant for the big powers.
I'm not sure about that. I think that comes in terms of how you're going to define your victory. There were many opportunities for France and the United States and Algeria and Vietnam to find ways that they could have come to an accommodation with the people that they ended up fighting. That's not how it worked out, but it doesn't mean it was impossible. I don't go with the sort of idea that it was simply, we could never have won. I don't think we were going to win them through massive use of force.
Margaret
We're going to use
MacMillan?
them through a smarter combination of politics and military.
Yeah, I think it was so much of what victory is after all how you define it, your objects at the beginning. And so if you declare a war on terror, there's no victory to be had. I mean, how do you possibly win a war on a concept like that? If you are trying to win a war militarily, then you can at least say, we've taken this land, we've defeated this armed force, they've surrendered. There's a very interesting encounter that took place between an American strategic thinker, Colonel Harry Summers, and a colonel of the North Vietnamese army after the war was over. And Summers said to the colonel, you know, you never defeated us militarily. And the North Vietnamese colonel thought, and he said, yes, but that was not the point. And I think that's very important. It's what you set out to do. And I think if you have modest goals, as they tended to in the 18th century, then you could say we've done it, and that's all. But you know, to leave a situation where the conflict goes on, is that really victory? And of course, it's not even taking into account those who really are the losers, and that's the civilians who have suffered through the war and go on suffering because there is no order and no stability.
Yeah.
We're going to look at civilians in a moment, but Jonathan, if I can bring you in, you constantly are looking at wars of our time. Do you draw lessons from the earlier big wars of our time?
Yeah, I do think there are some similarities. It just depends on the objectives, as Margaret was saying. So in Colombia, for example, the Colombian military were never actually under threat of being defeated by the FARC, but they couldn't defeat the FARC. The British Army was never under threat from the IRA of being defeated, but they were never going to be able to get rid of the IRA entirely by military means. So what that takes you to is you have to come to an accommodation. You have to come to an understanding. So the question is victory, as we have just had with ISIS in the Middle East, taking the territory? No, it isn't, because you have to go beyond that if you're actually going to settle, get to stability and get some normal life going again. So when Donald Rumsfeld said in Afghanistan, we don't do nation building, he was actually very mistaken. They could drive the Taliban out of the territory very easily. They could drive Al-Qaeda out. What they couldn't do was then settle the country, and that's what they've been trying to do ever since. And I would contest what Tarak has said about the Taliban winning. The Taliban haven't won. What the Taliban have done is not lost and outweighted the patience of the United States, and that's a different thing.
A lot of you now are talking about wars of our time and threading through some interesting points that, of course, have been with wars ever since there have been wars. But I think it would be useful just for us to set out very clearly what it is about wars in our time. And I speak in terms of this decade and recent decades. Margaret MacMillan, first of all, modern warfare, is it significantly different on some key fronts than earlier wars of the last century and earlier colonial wars?
Well, I think war has always been a complicated thing, and it has never been just state against state or army against army or navy against navy. There have always been other sorts of wars, and perhaps because of the impact of the two world wars, we tended to think in terms of those highly organized wars with organized sides, and you could tell who was on which side, and you could tell who was winning and who was losing. But we should remember that throughout history, there have been wars where the sides are not clear and where the objectives are not clear, and when you get shifting alliances. I mean, again, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, I think, is a really good example because people kept changing sides. There was a mix of religion, a mix of ideology, there were social revolutions, there were outside powers meddling. In some ways, it was very like Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan today. And so I think we have tended to think in terms of the two world wars because they seem to us the model of war, but we should remember that they're very different sorts of wars. And so many of the wars today are taking place not between organized nation states, but taking place often in failed states, which I think makes it much more difficult to bring them to an end, because it's very difficult to find anyone to negotiate with. And again, the parties keep shifting.
And Jonathan, isn't it also the case that there are many more states and many more non-state actors which are complicating the battlefield in this time?
Yes, I think that's right. I think we have many more civil wars nowadays and many fewer wars between states. And civil wars are uniquely complicated because the people are going to stay living on the same territory. So they have to come to some sort of accommodation. So if you think about Libya, for example, the Libyan people were pretty successful in their uprising against Gaddafi with the support of Western forces. But Western forces never went in on the ground. They never tried to settle the country into institutions. I went to Libya as David Cameron's special envoy, and they all said to me, "Thank you for supporting us in the revolution, but why on earth did you not come and help us build some institutions? Because without institutions, this place is never going to settle down." And we're now still living with those consequences of a failed state with General Haftar on one side, the UN recognized government on the other, clashing and clashing. And there's no obvious reason why this will come to an end unless someone does something about it. So I think we face a new sort of war, a war that can't be won just militarily, because it's a war that has to be won by both sides settling to live with each other.
And Tarak, you've studied, of course, in the age of imperial armies, Britain's role in war. The United States, of course, was a big actor, but we're seeing the retreat of these big powers, leaving it often to local proxies, regional players. How does that impact wars of our time?
Well, I think one thing I would say, just picking up some threads of the conversation, is that had the West tried to go into Libya with ground forces, it would have laid the basis for another insurgency of the kind that we've lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think it's actually possible in current conditions for Western ground forces to go in and rebuild societies and governments. We make ourselves targets. And one of the reasons that we do that is that while sometimes we think of this kind of distinction between interstate war and civil war, if we think of the Cold War as a whole, it was a world war. It was just fought in the Third World. It was World War III. The USSR and the US in a nuclear competition worked as a kind of central nervous system, to use Paul Thomas Chamberlain's phrase, distributing troops and resources and advice to wars around the world. These wars were connected, and they were kept going because they had a global dimension. I think I'd say the same thing about the war on terror. And just to wrap this up a little bit, of course, victory and defeat look different in a war fought in the global south. These are the wars of the weak against the strong. That is what's different about them, more than any particular aspect. I mean, war is always the same and war is always different. It's a kind of true chameleon that's always changing its nature. So it seems to me we need, if you choose not to stay in Afghanistan or Vietnam, as long as you're there with Western troops, the other guy will not win. The minute you decide you've had enough, the other guy does win, and that's a victory. The West has been profoundly defeated from 9/11 onwards. 9/11 was a decisive victory. If you want to think about what victory looks like in the contemporary world, all that had to happen was the 20 years of the West being drawn into insurgencies afterwards that it could never win. And we broke ourselves on those wars. We broke ourselves.
Jonathan, you want to add to that?
Well, I think there are wars you can win, even in modern days. If you think about Kosovo, for example, where the US and the UK and others went into Kosovo, and not only did they manage to drive Milosevic out, they drove Milosevic out of power. Well, actually, it was the people of Serbia who drove Milosevic out on the back of that. Or if you think of Sierra Leone, when Tony Blair was in government, we sent some very small forces in there, and they managed to push back the murderous gangs there in Sierra Leone. Touch wood, since then has been a relatively settled place. So it is possible for Western forces to intervene and be successful in some of these places. And we've tried both options. We've tried forces going in and overdoing it in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and forces not going in Syria or Rwanda or Libya. And in both cases, we end up with chaos, and with chaos that has consequences for us in terms of refugees, consequences for us in terms of terrorist attacks on our own territory. So I don't think we've yet found the magic answer to war or no war.
And Margaret MacMillan, I want to bring you in on something you've looked at a lot, consequences perhaps most of all for the civilians, when you move away from trench warfare to wars in which front lines go through neighborhoods, down streets, and sometimes right through houses, civilians are not just on the front line, they are the front line.
Well, I think, yes, and they always have been caught up in wars. I mean, even in wars with limited technology, people would attack the civilians on the other side to try and deny their support and their food or whatever they were producing to those in charge. But I think with the spread of technology, it's become much easier to hit large numbers of people through bombing, for example. But also the effort involved in modern war, particularly the sort of wars that we saw in the 20th century, means that civilians are very much part of the war effort. And so increasingly they have come to be seen as a legitimate target. Although we have tried very hard, I think, through Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions to try and keep civilians distinct from combatants, but the distinction gets blurred in war. You know, if you hit a factory in which civilians are working who are making the equipment the enemy needs, that's part of the war effort. And so, yes, I think civilians have suffered horrendously. And I think they suffer not just because of technology, they suffer also in these endless, the war sort of wars we've been talking about, these endless civil wars. They're the sort of fodder and they're the victims, and they get beaten about by both sides.
So you wouldn't say that the wars of our time, where you have a lot of if you take Syria or Libya, you have lots of fiefdoms, different military commanders fighting for their space, that civilians are not targeted more in our time? Or is it simply that we learn more about it because of people sending videos, posting videos on social media? We see more? Or is there actually more harm to civilians now and violations of international humanitarian law?
Well, I think, funnily enough, in the organized world wars, there is some prospect of protecting civilians because there are some rules and you have disciplined troops. But in the sorts of multi-shifting, shape-shifting wars that we get today where people change sides, civilians are simply people who happen to be in the way. You can exploit them, you can kidnap them, you can take the women to be slaves, to be forced wives, you can do what you want to the children. And I think there is a level of brutality. I mean, it's funny to think of different levels of brutality in war, but I think the sorts of wars we see today, there really are no limits to what people feel they're entitled to do. And the civilians, I think, pay a dreadful price. And of course, they've got no defense. You know, the international community makes noises, and occasionally we are successful. I mean, I think we were successful in Sierra Leone. And I think, just thinking back to what Jonathan and Tarak have both said, when the goals are limited and when the means is proportional to the goal, and when that goal has been achieved, then we have some hope of having peace. But when the goals are open-ended and when no one is prepared to really take the steps to try and limit it, then we see the ongoing misery. It just goes on and on that we see today.
Jonathan, you're in the business of trying to bring about an end to conflicts. Is it getting harder in these conflicts of our time where, as we've been saying, there's so many more regional actors and interests, so many more, it's often men with guns on the ground?
Yes, I mean, again, there's quite a lot of historical parallels. As Margaret was saying, the 30 Years' War, there's plenty of international involvement and mixing it up on various sides. And I don't know that has changed all that much. But if you think about Afghanistan, for example, if there's going to be peace in Afghanistan, it won't just be peace between the Taliban and the Americans. It won't just be peace between the different factions in Afghanistan. There'll be a role for Pakistan, for India, for China, for Russia, for the neighbors, for Iran, all of whom have their own conflicts and are fighting their own conflicts on the ground inside Afghanistan. The same is true, of course, in Syria, where there are a whole series of states playing out their own wars inside Syria, and the Syrian people are paying the price for that. You can find solutions to that. Venezuela played a role in the Colombian War over a long period of time. President Chavez provided safe haven for the FARC fighters and the ELN fighters. And it was only when President Santos reached out to President Chavez and persuaded him to become an advocate for peace, and he applied pressure to FARC, that you got into negotiations. So international involvement can be positive as well as negative in trying to get to peace.
Tarak, what do you think is the important ingredient in our time? Does one side have to have something approaching a military victory? We saw what happened in Sri Lanka. President Assad is now saying if he hasn't won the war, he hasn't lost the war, he's prevailing on the ground. What are the elements that you need to be able to say that, you know, that basically the conflict is, well, some would say over, even though it will continue on the ground?
I mean, it's, you know, listening to some of the accounts of conflicts here, you get a sense of the incredible complexity and the degree of international and different international states in those conflicts. How is it that you get to a situation which resolves both the local situation that people are fighting over and its interconnection with great power politics. That's a very difficult recipe. I think one of the other things I would say, just to point out for sort of completeness' sake, the amount of violence that individuals can do with modern munitions and weapons, even simple ones like AK-47s, is extraordinary in comparison to previous periods in history. So I think that's one aspect of it, of why it is that civilians suffer so much. Another one is that civilians are part of what is being fought over in civil wars. Some of the biggest battles that we fight right now are sieges. And starving a population under siege is part of the purpose of a siege. So they are caught up in ways that make them objects of the war. If you try to feed them from the point of view of the besieger, you're helping the enemy. I'm not going to make a distinction on the moral questions. I know where I would stand on this, but that's the reality of what these conflicts look like.
It's a terrible, terrible paradox of our time that we have this most advanced state-of-the-art technology using drones to kill people, for example, and to gather intelligence. But the warmongers are still using medieval tactics like siege, like rape as a weapon of war. And so, Margaret, plus ça change, plus c'est le même.
Yeah, no, it's just discouraging sometimes to look at human nature and think, you know, we condemn the crusaders who made the streets in Jerusalem run with blood, or who tried to sack Constantinople. But what are we doing today? I mean, you look at the destroyed cities of Syria and of Baghdad and what's happened in Afghanistan. And you know, there is, I mean, I think there's a very good argument. I mean, I tend to be with Hobbes that we need strong central power. And I hate to say this because I don't like to think it, but even a strong central power that is brutal can sometimes be better than the alternative. I mean, I read an interview the other day with people in Libya saying, well, at least with Gaddafi, we could send our children to school and the streets were safe. And they haven't had that since he fell.
Jonathan, throughout this conversation, you brought up the Taliban in Afghanistan, you brought up Islamic State. Is it more difficult to end conflicts when people are fighting for religion, for the establishment of an Islamic State, something which is, you know, comes from God, than it is to fight about interests over money, land, power? Jonathan?
Well, I think that's yet to be proven, but it is certainly the case that we have already managed to make peace with certain groups that are driven by religion. If you think of the GAM in Aceh in Indonesia, they were an explicitly Islamist movement, and yet we managed to make peace with them. The Moros Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines, explicitly Islamist movement, and we managed to make peace with them. Now the Americans and the Afghan government are negotiating with the Taliban. The Israeli government has negotiated with Hamas. So there's nothing that says that religious movements, or Islamic movements in particular, are impossible to negotiate with. There's an interesting question about globalism. If you have a global ideology of global domination in the way that Al-Qaeda does, for example, or ISIS does, that makes it more complicated. But even in those cases, when you deal with the specific groups, there is usually something you could talk about that is transactional and local. If you take Al-Shabaab, it is part of Al-Qaeda still, but you can negotiate with Al-Shabaab on local Somali issues. Boko Haram in Nigeria is part of ISIS, but you can negotiate specific local issues with them. So I think we sometimes exaggerate. We say, well, we've dealt with all these terrorists before, the IRA, the PLO, we're never going to negotiate with these new ones. Well, we are, and we will.
All of you are there's also the big question about if civilians imagine victory in our endless wars, they may imagine, and we're seeing this in Afghanistan, they will imagine rights for women, rights for civil society. And there is this big question now in ending wars of our time, is that you do need to have civil society and women at the table, and the evidence seems to suggest that makes a difference. Margaret, your view on that?
Well, I think the more people who are involved in peace, the better. I mean, peace getting peace is an absence of violence, and it's reestablishing some sort of authority. But if it's going to last, then of course people have to buy into it. We know that women, even in very traditional roles, have tremendous influence over the children they bring up. And so if you can get them buying in, if you can get everyone buying in, and you have to think also, and Jonathan and Tarak will know more about this than me, you have to think also about how to bring those who've been fighting back in to society, how to reintegrate them. And I do think forgiveness and reintegration is an enormously important part of building lasting peace.
Tarak, you're nodding.
I'm agreeing with much that's being said. I just am more pessimistic about the prospects for some of this in the current environment than in the past. It's not clear to me that everyone fighting who's a civilian in Afghanistan, what they're asking for are things that sound like the European Enlightenment. Which is also not to say that they're not capable of democracy or something like that. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that we in the West also have universal ideological goals that we impose on other people's conflicts. They also derive from a religion, Christianity, that imagines things in universalist terms. So I'm not sure, it's only one side, as it were, that has religion. And the other side is coming with reason to this. In some of the specific conflicts that we're talking about now, it seems to me there are too many spoilers to get to the kind of peaceful situation that Jonathan's talking about. I don't at all say that that's not possible in certain conditions, but I think there are too many spoilers and too many sources of outside support to just imagine these as civil conflicts that can be brought to a rest. I do agree very much, Lyse, with the comment you made that order is a value all its own. And that is something that central governments that are strong in the Hobbesian way that Margaret was talking about are able to provide, and that's no laughing matter.
Jonathan, does it, Tarak just used the word spoilers. You know all about spoilers in the conflicts that you've been trying to resolve. The fact that we have, particularly the United States in retreat, showing no interest now really in solving the world's big problems, does it make a difference in achieving something which could be called a victory, an end to a war, that there's no big power with the means and the will to enforce it?
Well, quite often the United States was the spoiler, so I'm not sure that the removal of the United States necessarily, nor my own country, Britain, has necessarily got a brilliant history of peacemaking rather than war making. So I don't know that hegemonic states are necessarily the answer to the problem. Spoilers quite often nowadays are about war economies. It's about soldiers or guerrillas who can make money from the war, and how do you persuade them to give that up? If you think of the Niger Delta, with a series of young men who went from $1 a day to a couple of $100 a day, to no esteem to high esteem. How do you change their minds and get them to accept peace? But I do want to inject some optimism into this discussion, because I don't actually believe there is such a thing as an insoluble conflict, a war that will go on forever. No one believed that Northern Ireland could be solved. Mrs. Thatcher believed it was insoluble. Winston Churchill believed it was insoluble. In the end, it was solved. And all of these problems, they take a lot of time to solve them. In Northern Ireland, there were repeated attempts at peace. There was Sunningdale in '73, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in '85, Downing Street Declaration in 1993. But the Good Friday Agreement didn't come from nowhere. The Good Friday Agreement was actually called Sunningdale for Slow Learners by Seamus Mallon, who was because it had the same measures in it at that time. So you can get to peace. It just often takes a lot of effort to get there.
I know you used to the phrase mutually hurting stalemate, Jonathan, for Northern Ireland, and many other conflicts have looked at that as well. When both sides accept there is no military solution, then you can move towards a negotiation. But while one still believes that they can still win, that is a drag on any efforts towards peace.
Well, that's certainly what happened in Northern Ireland, the academic notion of a perceived mutually hurting stalemate. Probably about the late 70s, the British Army realized they could go on forever and contain the IRA, but they weren't going to defeat them by purely military means. I think about the mid-1980s, Adams and McGuinness, who joined the Republican movement very young, also realized that they were never going to be defeated, but they were never going to get the Brits out by force. In the meantime, their nephews, nieces, etc., are being arrested. That's when they reached out first to John Hume, who deserved his Nobel Prize for reaching out to them and making peace at great cost, then to the Irish government, then to the British government. So it's when both sides come to that sense of needing to get to the end. The same thing in Colombia. President Santos had actually been the hammer of the FARC as the Minister of Defense in Colombia. But when he came to power, he realized that he was not going to defeat them by military means. And the FARC leadership, who've been fighting for decades, also realized they need to get to peace. So it can happen if you have this combination of a perceived mutually hurting stalemate plus leadership on both sides. That can work.
Distinguished panelists, I must end by asking you, of course, a question of our time, and that, of course, is our global pandemic. Do you think that now that we're moving into post-lockdown and the financial, economic, political consequences of this are becoming clear, and of course making it difficult for mediators to meet around the world, do you expect in the post-pandemic phase, whenever we get to that it will be a time of more conflict, not less, more difficult to end the wars of our time? Tarak?
I think we're entering a very dangerous time, and I think COVID has accelerated things that were underway already. We're coming into an era of constant geopolitical competition, and I fear that it's going to bring war back in a major way to the West and its civilians before we're through this next bout. So I'm very pessimistic about what's happening right now. And I think there is a big gap between liberal-minded Western publics and governments that probably need to be thinking very hard about military and other forms of geopolitical competition and increasing their defense budgets. So I'm very concerned about where things are going now.
Jonathan?
I agree. I share Tarak's fears that this could, after this, the chances are we'll have more violence, more wars rather than less. But some interesting things have happened during the pandemic. Some of the efforts to reach ceasefires have paid off. In South Thailand, for example, there is a cessation. In the Philippines, there was briefly a cessation. In some areas of Afghanistan, there is cooperation between the government and the Taliban in contested areas in dealing with COVID. COVID is both a reason to get people to cooperate, to try and fight the pandemic, but also an opportunity to get parties to engage that could lead on to greater things in terms of ceasefires and negotiations. I think Afghanistan's one of the hopes. I think Venezuela is another possibility where you could get there. So it is looking pretty gloomy ahead, I must admit. But the pandemic itself has had some surprising results in terms of actually getting negotiations going.
Margaret MacMillan?
Lyse, that is a very good question, and I do worry about it. I think not so much because of the pandemic itself, but because the institutions of international governance and international order in the world were already breaking down. And the ways in which we have scrambled, the nations of the world have scrambled to try and deal with the pandemic is not an encouraging omen for what they might do in future in dealing with conflicts where they need to cooperate. I think the lack of coordination, the failure of leadership on the part of particularly, I think, the United States, and also I think the attempt to blame each other for the pandemic is not a good augury for what is likely to happen next. We will need coordinated international action to deal with pandemics and of course to deal with the wars that continue to go on and will happen in the future. But at the moment, it doesn't look like we've got much of it.
So do we then conclude in wars in the times in which we live, Tarak, that a military victory has become more difficult, if not impossible, or there still will be times where that warring sides will seek it and achieve it?
I really think the idea of a military victory as some sort of separate category of things is a kind of product of Western militaries trying to get bigger budgets. War is always political. It's always about using force to achieve a political objective, and it's about marrying up the force and the politics that you're after and doing so in the face of an opponent who's trying to achieve his objectives with force. And I don't think that sort of essential nature of war has changed. That's very much still with us. People can win victories by using force if they've got that force in tune with the political objectives that are realistic and attainable. Getting the United States out of Afghanistan, I think, is one of those objectives, and it's just about to be achieved.
Jonathan?
I think you can still win a war if you are an autocratic state or prepared to use methods that perhaps Western states would not be prepared to use. If you think of Sri Lanka, when the Rajapaksa family took on the Tamil Tigers, and the Tamil Tigers, who'd been considered completely impossible to defeat, crumbled because they tried to fight a conventional campaign. But if the Rajapaksas had stuck to Western methods rather than at Nandakal Lagoon killing very large numbers of civilians, they probably wouldn't have won. If you think of President Putin in Chechnya, the methods he used in Chechnya are not methods that we could use, but he did get a victory of sorts. The trouble with those sort of victories, a bit like Stalin's victories inside the Soviet Union, is that they just make frozen conflict. You win in terms of controlling the terrain, but the resentments are there and they come back again 10, 20, 30, or even 40 years later. So if that is victory, you can achieve that sort of victory, but it isn't a long-lasting peace of the sort that we would expect a victory to mean.
I think even I very much agree with that. But if I could, the Good Friday Agreement also can be interpreted in that kind of a way. It means one thing now, but were the conflict to start up, or from the point of view of Irish Republicans who are after United Ireland, that is one moment in a much longer war in the way that they define it, a much longer conflict. So the meaning of that agreement may look somewhat different 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when events that we can imagine have taken place.
I agree, but I would interpret it in a different way, that I don't have a problem with conflict. If Irish Republicans want to achieve a united Ireland by politics, by persuading people, even by having more babies, then that's fine. That's allowed. It's when they kill people to get there that it's not fine. And that's, I think, the difference. I mean, if you think about ETA in Spain has been fighting all this time. Having given up fighting, they're now the second biggest party in the Basque Country. Sinn Féin are now the largest party probably in Northern Ireland. So it's okay to have a conflict in political terms. It's just not to use military means to get there, because then you won't get the other side to accept it. That's, I think, the distinction I draw.
I very much agree with that. I very much agree with that distinction, but what I would point out is that that's exactly what Sinn Féin has done. They've used military force to get where they are today, which has enabled them politically.
Well, it wasn't actually military force that got them there. And this is one of the things I'd contest. The reason we had to talk to Sinn Féin in the end was not because they had guns. It was because they still had a third of the Catholic vote at the height of the Troubles. They had genuine political support. Had they been Baader Meinhof or Brigati Rossi, we could have ignored them and policed them out of existence. As long as they had support, we couldn't deal with them. And that's I think the mistake we're making about ISIS and some of these other groups. Taliban, they have genuine support. They are not just as we'd like to dismiss them as terrorists. And that's why we have to talk to them.
So many more questions we could ask and so many answers we'd be interested in hearing. But that's all the time we have for today as we considered what a crucial question of our time. Mission accomplished, reimagining victory at a time of endless wars. I think you'll agree that we owe big thanks to Tarak Barkawi, to Jonathan Powell, and to Margaret MacMillan for joining us with their wisdom, insights, and even a bit of hope.